Hello, my name is Professor McAngus, and I have been asked to give a presentation today for the Department of Communication. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I thank you for your attention. They've asked me to give a presentation where I would give you a sample of a course that I'll be teaching next semester, and I've decided on a course that's called Mass Communication Law. This is a class we teach for our students who are going into the fields of journalism and public relations, advertising, and politics, because it focuses on the issues of free speech and the limits of free speech, and talks to you about all the things that can get you in trouble in media. And so it's a very media intensive class. We see a lot of music, we see a lot of film clips, we talk about people who are famous, who have been experienced with censorship in the American system. That's what we focus on. So I want to start the presentation by showing you a music clip, which is actually very modern and very timely, and because it deals with a Korean K-pop star who is actually suing a lot of her fans for saying bad things about her on Twitter. So let me go ahead and show you that, and we'll get started. Yes, it is true. I show K-pop videos in my class. Now, you may well ask, why would you do that? The answer is a little complicated. First of all, let's be clear, I show K-pop videos before class, not during, unless there's a particular sample clip that I want to show during my lectures, if it applies well to the curriculum. There are a number of reasons for that. First of all, I've had students who say, I never missed a class of yours because I always want to see the K-pop videos. Great, perfect attendance, that's what I'm going for. Also, I've had students who said, I was never late to your class because I wanted to see the K-pop videos. I'll do whatever it takes to get you in your seat. But there's something else. It turns out that college can be a very challenging time. Many people are away from home for the first time. They're staying in the dormitories. They don't have any friends yet. It can be very isolating, particularly now during the coronavirus lockdown. You have people who are homesick, can be very lonely, and people can feel depressed at times. And it is true in America and around the world, but particularly in Korea, that people who are of the age group of high school graduates and college freshmen are the most likely people to attempt suicide. Now, we've been very fortunate here. I've been here for 6 years. The school's been here for 7 years. We've never lost a student to suicide. And fingers crossed on that one. The truth is that I care about my students very much. And anything that I can do to put a smile on your face for a moment so that you don't have a harder day, I will do that for you. That's part of why I do these things. Besides, I like to have fun. Most people like to have fun. Plus, I have a soft spot in my heart for IU, so here you go. Well, let's get on with the lecture then. So Mass Comm Law is Comm 5300, which is a senior level class. For many people, it's the last class that they take before they graduate. So today's lecture, what I would do typically is I would start off by having the chapter heading from the textbook, which would talk about all the issues that'll be discussed in that class period, giving the students an outline of what I'm going to address and how they would fill in the blanks on their lecture. So generally speaking, we start off with the very basic things. We talk about the history of free speech and how it evolved into what it is today. In the American system, even for American students, it can be tricky. If you ask them, where does free speech come from? They say, the Constitution. Here's the First Amendment. Now, all of the amendments say many things, but in this case, we have the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law, and it talks about the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble peacefully, freedom to address grievances to the government. So we're talking about freedom of speech and of the press here. But the truth is that we don't get our rights from the Constitution. There is a philosophy that says that rights don't come from the government, they come from God. And if you don't want to talk about things in a religious context, you say that rights come from the nature of human existence. Because it's very important, let me just ask the audience, if the government gives you rights, what else can the government do? Take them away. And see, that's the point of a right. A right cannot be taken away. This is very important because in many countries this is not true. Many countries who consider themselves to be free societies, at least more free than they used to be, don't have a constitution. Many countries do have a constitution, but you have a situation where the law establishes what you're allowed to do. That's the opposite of a right. Constitutions limit the power of oppressive government to address the will of the people. It frees the people against the tyranny of government, whereas the law empowers the government to impose its rules on the people. That's the difference between a right and a law. So we talk about this quite a bit. So one of the things we discuss quite a bit is the concept of censorship, where the government says, free speech, of course, but abuse of free speech, profanity, hate speech, these kinds of things. This is a very timely topic these days. And so we show a lot of media, songs and film that have been the subject of oppression and censorship. This song I'm going to show you now is the most highly censored song in the history of rock and roll in America. And it may surprise you, but let's have a look at it. We'll stop it there. I love watching these old videos because it's a frozen moment in time. And the fact is that those sexy dancing girls are probably now about 70 years old. It's like watching the white girls trying to dance. Now you may ask, why would this song, which seems so tame and simple, why would that be censored? It's because people thought it was obscene. They thought that it was incomprehensible. They couldn't understand the words because it sounds like it's an old sort of it's written in the style of what we call a sea shanty, which is like sailors talking about, I'm going to come home and see my girl and this kind of thing. And it's not written in plain speaking English. It's written in what's called the Jamaican patois. Are we getting is our volume okay? Can you guys hear this? It's written in what's called the Jamaican patois, which is a sort of a pidgin English and French. So if you listen to the words, it's hard to tell what they're saying. And so people assumed the worst possible words you can imagine, sexual words and horrible things. And so it was banned off the radio, which cost this band probably millions of dollars because it got less airplay. And so there was actually an obscenity hearing in America, and the judge determined that it was completely incomprehensible and therefore could not be obscene. If you couldn't understand the words, then they couldn't be dirty words. So the most famous and censored song in American history. So it's a good example in the curriculum. So one of the things we talk about in the concept of the freedom of speech and freedom of the press is the concept of the people having the power to overrule the government in a number of ways. The first one we talk about is called jury nullification. This is where you have people who are called in for jury duty. Usually it's 12, but not always 12 people. They go to the courtroom and they listen to the court case, and they're asked to rule on the verdict of a person being innocent or guilty. And now you may ask, why would they ask the common person who probably knows next to nothing about the law to make this kind of a ruling? Many people say, why do they want me here? They have the judge, they have the law, they have the police, they have the prosecutor, the defense attorney, they have the people who are accused, and I don't know anything about it. Why do they want me to do it? And the answer is, they want the public to provide the perspective of their common sense, which can sometimes say, you know, that's just not fair this time. There may be a technical violation of the law, but if we apply our collective common sense, we'd say, let's make an exception this time. Jury nullification allows members of the public to decide to apply their own common sense to overrule the letter of the law where it makes sense in the case. And it's a very powerful right that the people have over the government. The next one is the heckler's veto. A heckler is a person in the audience who laughs or boos or demonstrates their approval or disapproval of what's being said. This happens a lot in political speech, it happens a lot at political protests, and it happens a lot in comedy. Now, if you think about it, a comedian gets up and he or she delivers their routine, which they've practiced in front of the audience. And one night they get up there and they give their presentation, and the audience roars with laughter, and they say, "I killed," right? And then they come out the next night and they give the same presentation, same jokes, delivered with the same energy. The audience doesn't laugh. And they say, "Well, the audience was stupid." Well, who's right? The answer is the audience is always right, because they're the consumer of the media, and you're the presenter, the seller. And if they're not buying, then you're not selling. And they will tell you if you're funny. Well, the Hecklers veto says the audience has the right to collectively laugh or boo you off the stage if they don't agree with your message. And even though you'd say, "Well, I have a right to free speech," that's correct. So do they. And their collective free speech overpowers yours, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's the power of the people over the individual. So the Heckler's veto, very important and very timely. This is an example of a film star, very famous film star, who faced censorship all through his career. And let's see if you recognize who it is, and we'll discuss it after. Here we go. And of course, it's all a dream. This is from a film called Gold Rush with Charlie Chaplin, and that scene was called Dance of the Dinner Rolls. When we see Chaplin, we say, what you're going to see on the screen is magic, because he was like a ballet dancer. Probably the most famous man in the world at the time during silent film times. He figured out that as a silent film performer, all he had to do was change a few word cards throughout the film, and suddenly his film was in German, French, English, Korean, Japanese, and he could send his films around the world as long as he didn't have to actually talk. It was really a brilliant thing. Charlie Chaplin faced censorship all through his career for a number of reasons. There used to be what they call the censorship boards and the morality standards in film in America. And they took note of the fact that the character he always played was called the tramp. This is a man who's not married. He has no family. He's not working. He has no job. He has no money. He lives as a hobo. He doesn't like the police. He doesn't have a real plan for his life. And they thought, what a terrible example for young men in America. And so they didn't like that. Go ahead. Thank you. Got it. Also, there was concern that he had evaded military service during World War I and World War II because he was not an American, he was British. And he came to America to make his money with the Max Sennett Company. And he made these films like The Keystone Cops, which are very famous. And he also, he couldn't be called into military service by the British because he was living in America. And he couldn't be called into the American military because he was not an American citizen. He never applied for American citizenship and considered himself to be a citizen of the world. And he was very much the target of scorn by the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, who hated him and eventually deported him from America. His films were censored quite a bit, and there were many theaters that wouldn't play them because they felt that it was a morally reprehensible person. And so it damaged his career quite a bit. So let's moving on. So the next thing we'll talk about is in every country, no matter what the system of government, there is a temptation by officials in the government who want to, they feel that it's important to censor speech, particularly if the speech is critical of the form of government or of leadership. I mean, think about examples of, North Korea. You're not allowed to criticize the great leader. You could go to prison, even be executed, right? Every country is tempted to shut down speech that they don't like. But there are these theories to try to explain why that's not important, that it doesn't really serve a purpose, and that the government doesn't even have to worry about it, really, not in a free society. So there are these 7 theories we discuss. One is called Absolutist theory. Absolutist theory simply says the Constitution means absolutely what it says. Congress shall make no law. What part of that don't you understand? Now, I should say that absolutist theory is not the theory that we apply in American society. There are limits to free speech. One of the most commonly used examples is there's a Supreme Court case where the Chief Justice said, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Now, why would that be? Why can't you yell fire in a crowded theater? Well, there could be a stampede of people that would trample innocents. Now, if you look around the world every year, there are people who are killed because of a stampede. We see people that go on these treks, let's say the Hajj in Mecca. You get over 1 million people in one space. And there's some loud noise which people mistake for a gunshot or something, and they start to run. Small children fall down and are trampled by people under their feet. Old people fall over. There are deaths every year like this. So in a theater, if there is a fire, go ahead and yell fire. Warn the people, that's fine. But if there isn't a fire, you shouldn't be allowed to have this unnecessary risk to public safety just so you can laugh about it. And so they limit that and say, free speech, yes, but within reason. There is a reasonable restriction on the unnecessary risk to public safety. So we don't apply absolutist theory in reality, but it is a theory. There are people that say, no, I should be able to yell fire in a theater if I want to. It's free speech. The Constitution says I can do that. The second one is called ad hoc balancing theory. So balancing theory means the courts will get these cases that are very new. They haven't had to handle these issues before. You know, you get a case that says someone yelled fire in a crowded theater. Why would they do that? Some guy did it. What do? There's the whole thing about free speech. It's competing against the interests of public safety. So there are these interests you have to balance. Ad hoc means that you make it up as you go along. And so what it says is that you simply have to balance the competing interests when you make these rules. You can't ignore one and not the other. They have to all be upheld to a certain degree. Ad hoc balancing theory. Next, we have what's called preferred position balancing theory. And that just says that as you balance, very similar to the previous one, you should prefer to preserve the rights of the people. So if you were to say, we want to preserve the right to free speech, and therefore nothing can be against the law, including yelling fire in a theater. But that doesn't make any sense. So if you said, okay, you can say whatever you want, and there can be no restriction on free speech, also doesn't make any sense because you don't want to have credible threats of death and this kind of thing. So you have to preserve both, but you have to prefer to preserve the rights of the people whenever possible. The next one is called Micheljannian theory, very interesting. Alexander Micheljan was a philosopher. He had a very interesting theory. He said, any criticism of the government is ultimately a good thing. And many people would say, how can that be? Well, the answer is, it turns out that there are only two types of criticism of the government. The first one is criticism that is correct. It's true. And that's okay because the person is just pointing out things we can do better. That's a good thing. The other kind of criticism is criticism that is false. And the theory there is that it'll become clear over time that the person was wrong. And all that means is, look, things are better than he said. And that's okay too. There's never a reason for people to ban the criticism of the government because ultimately it's always a good thing. That's a bit of an extreme view, but one that is very favorable these days. Now, marketplace of ideas theory of free speech says that all philosophies should be available, like the goods in a market, and that those that are popular will sell. They'll move. The ones that are less popular will sit on the shelf, become old and expire, and be thrown out like the trash at a farmer's market. So there's no reason to ban them. Do you realize in America, there's an American Nazi party, there's an American Communist Party, an American Socialist Party, American Green Party, an American aluminum hat wearing whack job party. All the parties are allowed. None of them are illegal. Even the most extreme and fringe groups are legal because they're unimportant. They're insignificant. And so banning them would just give them more attention, would give them more power socially. They would have a verified right to complain. You realize that the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, has at times defended groups, reprehensible groups like the Ku Klux Klan, because governments tried to ban them from speech or marching or whatever. But it's a perfectly legal American right, no matter how crazy you are. And it was very important to preserve those rights, not just for them, but for everybody. And so we say, trying to ban things you don't like is dangerous because, Yes, perhaps I don't like what you say today because it's racist, but that's because the people that I agree with are in charge. In the future, people that I don't agree with might be in charge, and then they will say that what I'm saying should be banned. We don't want that. That's why it's dangerous and important. Access theory is the theory that in order to truly have free speech, you have to have access to the medium of expression. And people often complain. They'll say things like, oh, take an extreme example, like there's a guy on the radio in America, very popular, named Rush Limbaugh, a very conservative guy, has a radio show 5 days a week, 3 hours a day. He's on the radio talking about what he thinks. And I listen to him, actually I don't, but if I did, I would say, you know, I think that my opinions are just as good, or perhaps even superior to his. How come I don't have 3 hours on the radio? Well, the answer is you don't. He does, you don't. He gets to do that as his job and you don't. So he has more access to the medium than you. I remember there was a famous example of a radio show where a caller called in and said, you talk all day, let me talk. And he says, yes, it's my show. You should get one of your own. Exactly. That's how you get this, get your own show. Then you can say whatever you want. There are people who say that there were what they call influencers in free thinking. These are people that can put their column in the newspaper, they can have their voice heard on TV, and they're not as smart as me or you, but somehow they're on there. They have access to the medium, so they have free speech, but I have less free speech. That's access theory. One of the famous sayings is, freedom of the press belongs to the man who owns one. And that's a reference to William Randolph Hearst, who used to own newspapers and movie studios and radio stations. He was famous for manufacturing the news, which was very often fake, in order to sway public opinion toward things he wanted people to think and do. So political access theory. Self-realization theory is very interesting. It has to do with the fact that sometimes you have people that have very extreme views. I mean, you hear these things a lot. They'll say, Reagan is a Nazi, Bush is an idiot, Obama's a Muslim. And these are very fringe views. And you'd say, well, that's obviously not true, or it's not provably true, or what have you. So we don't necessarily want to ban that because it just gives them attention. They have the right to their free speech, but what they're saying is false, or at least I don't agree with it. I don't know, what do you think? The whole point of it is, people that have these views, and really all of us, if you give people a chance to have their say, then they feel better. They feel fulfilled. Self-realization. I'm going to get my t-shirt that says, Trump must be driven out of office, and I'm going to stand there on the mountaintop for all to see. It makes no difference whatsoever. But for that person, he feels self-realized, and things are good within him. And so that's self-realization theory. And so what we're saying is, you have these very fringe, unpopular, and extreme views. The government should never ban them because it's pointless to do so. You're just giving them attention. Now, this is an example of a media. This is, it has been said by people who are keen observers of social order. Jimi Hendrix playing the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock is the single most significant bit of artistic expression in an anti-war vein ever, ever. It's very interesting because here was a man who was black. Actually, he was from a mixed family. His mother came from blacks who were intermarried with Native American people. And so he was, by any definition, a fringe outsider in American society. And yet he played rock and roll music better than any white person ever did. And his audience was almost 90% white people. And so he faced censorship over this performance, even though it's very famous. Of course, it was in the film about Woodstock. He was at the concert. He sold millions of records. But it was banned off the radio because it was during the Vietnam War. There were people, including political leaders, who said, how dare you, during a time of war, play our national anthem in such an inflammatory way? But people would sometimes say, well, what about him? He was in the Army. He was in the 101st Airborne during Vietnam. He didn't actually go to Vietnam because he was injured. He was a former soldier. He has the right as an American citizen to do and say whatever he wishes. And this performance is vitally important to the social conscience of the time. So I'm going to play this song. I'll probably take us out to the end of our time, but I just want to say how much I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to you today. I'm very grateful for those of you that listened in. So I'm going to play this song for you now. Many of you have never heard it before, which I think is tragic. And here we go. And there you have it. Jimi Hendrix playing the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock. This brings my presentation to an end. I'd like to thank all of you who are in attendance. It's been a great honor for me, and I thank you very much.